Hi there, and welcome to Where's the Money Gone, the podcast that takes you inside the football boardroom with me, Adrian Goldberg, and Charlie Methven. I'm a West Bromwich Albion season ticket holder. Pray for me. I'm an investigative journalist and author of Where's the Money Gone? The Battle for the Soul of English Football, the ideal Christmas gift, available now via Byline Books. Charlie is managing director of Mount Pleasant FC in Jamaica, a shareholder of the Belgian club REC Mons. He was formerly a director of both Sunderland and Charlton Athletic, as well as being a boyhood Oxford United fan. This time, Gianni Infantino's cringeworthy brown-nosing of Donald Trump. He was awarded FIFA's first peace prize at the World Cup draw last week, ahead of next year's tournament, which mostly takes place in the United States. Infantino, FIFA's president, has also been chummy, shall we say, with Saudi Arabia's repressive ruler Mohammed bin Salman, awarding the 2034 World Cup to the Gulf state without a vote. Does football really need to cozy up to politicians like this? Isn't the global game already, well, global, without having to rely on support from leaders who might variously be described as narcissistic and even murderous? Isn't there a reputational risk to the game cozying up to rulers like this? Plus, Brighton and Hove Albion owner Tony Bloom has been accused by The Guardian of being involved in a secret gambling syndicate, which has even bet on his own team in breach of the rules. Bloom says the claims are entirely false and he is considering legal action. Plus, what do you do with a player like Mo Salah, dropped by Liverpool, now sounding off to the media? Charlie, before we get stuck into what is a pretty intense menu this week.
It's pretty meaty, isn't it? It's pretty meaty.
It's meaty. Tell me about the football. I should tell you that this weekend I went to see West Brom lose 3-1 at QPR, and despite having listened very intently to our guest last week from the 21st group, who talked about the minimal change that it really makes in most cases by switching head coach, I'm now calling for my club to change their head coach, because I have seen things I have seen things in the last few weeks that have just made me think, no, this guy Ryan Mason isn't the man for the job. But we shall see. The club may take a different view, but I think as supporters, we have made up our minds pretty conclusively. How's your football weekend been?
Well, I'm going to keep this brief, partially because I've got a bit of a headache thinking about it at the moment, but also because we just got such big topics to talk about. Huge congratulations to my colleagues at Mount Pleasant for winning the Caribbean Cup final this week,
Brilliant.
and therefore qualifying, getting a bye through to the last 16 of the CONCACAF Champions knockout stages. The draw is coming up this coming week, so we look to see what fate awaits us, or what exciting things await us. Could be a trip to the Azteca. It could be a game against Inter Miami. All sorts of things could await there. But a real, well done, and a thank you to our footballing team at Mount Pleasant. I myself today am in Belgium. I came across this morning to Brussels to watch Mons play against a team in our league who sort of play in a non-league stadium in not a bit unfair, a lower league stadium in Brussels. It's one of those games where you really, if you're going to win the title, you probably want to go and win it 2 or 3-0. And our captain got sent off inside 10 minutes. And we suffered a last-minute dodgy sort of penalty, or last 5 minutes dodgy penalty again. So we ended up drawing 2-2, bottom line. But it was not a restful experience. And I think I shall leave it at that for now, because, as I said, we've got a lot to talk about.
Indeed, Charlie. I do hope RAC Mons aren't in the process of bottling it, as they say in football. We shall see. I'm sure they won't. I'm sure they won't. Let's talk about Infantino then, because he's such a strange character, isn't he? The president of FIFA. He's been president of FIFA since 2016. Replaced Sepp Blatter, who was accused of all sorts of illegality, let's put it bluntly, but no charges have stuck in courts of law against Blatter, although various civil cases are still ongoing. Infantino was the man seen as the new broom, the man to clean out the stables. Here he is, just taking part in the most arrogant, most arrogant sucking up to Donald Trump. He doesn't need to do that, does he? Football doesn't need him to do that in order to secure a successful World Cup in the United States. He doesn't need to cozy up to bloody dictators like Mohammed bin Salman. Surely they need him and they need football more than he needs either of them.
This is a very complex, multifaceted topic. So I have to understand that FIFA is mandated to be non-political, right? So your bloody dictator, in FIFA's world, that is a head of state, or in this case, the son of a head of state, actually, as it happens, but whatever it might be.
The de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, though, we'd recognise that.
Correct.
Yeah,
correct. So as far as his position at FIFA is concerned, it's not up to him to determine who he approves of, who he doesn't, which countries he approves of, which countries he doesn't, because all of these countries are member states, constituent member states of the body that he runs. So they're all basically shareholders, right? So it's rather like the EFL and the EPL executives when they have to sort of discipline their clubs. It's like, fundamentally, they work for the clubs, and the head of FIFA works for the federations of each country that vote for him, effectively, or sometimes don't vote for him. Clearly, he had a majority last time, which actually was unopposed, I think. But anyway, he would have had a majority, and therefore, those are his stakeholders. He also, and I'm just playing devil's advocate here before I get into some other stuff. He also has a duty to make sure that the tournaments that FIFA put on go as well as they possibly can do, and any kind of political grandstanding by Infantino, which would then lead to tournaments going wrong, whilst it might please New York Times and Guardian readers in America and England, is not going to go down well with the broader footballing family, many of whose federations rely on successful World Cups for financial support, right? So that's the way in which the whole web works, is you put on a successful World Cup, it makes a lot of money, that money then gets spread out through the whole world to fund all sorts of mostly pretty good projects, but historically also some not such great projects, let's say, but mostly pretty good projects. And I think, to be fair, under Infantino, the sort of smell of proper corruption has largely pretty much dissipated, if to be honest with you, over the last 8 years. So basically where we're at now is saying it is entirely legitimate for him not to take a view on Mohammed bin Salman. It's entirely legitimate for him to want to have good relations with Donald Trump as the head of state of the country which is about to host the World Cup. For me, that's all part of his mandate. And if we don't like the mandate, we have to change the mandate. What is a little bit creepy is the extent of it, right? So it's not just, I'm going to do a professional job of having proactively good relations with the US, all parts of the US, but whoever happens to be president right now. When it goes beyond that to creating new prizes to give to the president of the United States, and he didn't even tell the council that he was creating that prize. He didn't even tell the FIFA council he was doing it. So it wasn't even part of a broader, more considered discussion. This was simply, I know what will make my friend Donald really happy is if I give him a really big glitzy prize. That starts to feel a bit icky to me, because he is just the president of a federated body. He's not he doesn't own FIFA. He doesn't own world football. So that felt a bit rotten. And I think probably the other bit that I'm a little bit sort of like, clearly Donald Trump's somebody who likes to be flattered, but he is also somebody actually who various people have worked out that if you do develop a reasonable relationship with him, you can speak truth to power. You can, and people do. People who have made, if the point of what Infantino's doing is to get himself in a place where he can have a good relationship with Trump, when Trump says things like, oh, I'm simply going to ban fans from lots of the countries who are trying to come here because at the moment they wouldn't qualify under immigration rules, or I'm going to shift games from this city to that city because they're Democrat voting, whatever it might be. I think that's the moment. And actually, to be fair, even our blessed Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, fulfills at least this basic thing of saying, on this particular point, dear Donald, I disagree with you, right? So you at least have to uphold the dignity of your office enough to say publicly, I might agree with you on many things. I might think you're a very great man, but on this, I disagree with you on behalf of the body I represent.
Yeah, and I think you make fair points. I suppose the difference between being the EFL or the Premier League is that albeit that their owners and directors tests, as we've demonstrated many times, and as I explore in my book, they're deeply flawed owners and directors tests. Nevertheless, they exist. And of course, there is no equivalent for who is going to be your country leader or who represents you in that sense at FIFA, is there? So, you kind of have a fit and proper person test that says, I don't like Donald Trump because he's a greedy bully, or I don't like Mohammed bin Salman, even though his country, the country of which he's the de facto ruler, puts to death people who committed crimes when they were children and denies basic human rights. So clearly, on the evidence that you've set out, Infantino does not have that choice. He has to accept that Trump is the president, the democratically elected president, we should say, of the United States, and MBS is the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia. But I do think that there is something deeply unpleasant about the sport that we all love being used in a way that appears to cozy up to these very unpleasant people.
Yeah, and I think that Peace Prize really does push that envelope too far. Say the other thing that's really sort of dicked me off about Infantino in the last couple of weeks is what he did with Ronaldo and the suspension.
I was going to come to that, yeah. And again, for people who don't know, Ronaldo was facing a 3-game ban ahead of the World Cup in the US, Canada, and Mexico. And Infantino, as far as I can tell, Charlie, unilaterally has decided to reduce the 3-game ban to a 1-game ban, meddling with the disciplinary processes of the game without any let or hindrance and without any precedent for doing such a thing.
I just find that all the other stuff I've said, I might not like it, but I find excusable, understandable, maybe except for the Peace Prize. But the rest of it I find understandable. This bit I find inexcusable. Absolutely. When you enter a competition, you have to sign up to the rules of the competition. And if the rules of the competition say that suspensions are carried over into the World Cup, by the way, I don't think they should be, as it happens. I think you should start the World Cup with a blank sheet of paper, but leaving that to one side. If the rules of the competition are what they are, they have to apply to everybody in the same way. There's no, well, let's say there's no way you can change that. Well, clearly there is, because he has. But I think that really does say something to me about Infantino's current state of mind, which rather concerns me. That's playing God. Right, that's basically saying that I am now going to determine who plays, who doesn't play, purely on a whim, purely because I decide that actually that would be in the game's interest. But it's not in the game's interest, because the integrity, the sporting integrity of the greatest sports event on earth, which I do believe the World Cup to be, is far more important than whether a few more people around the world might tune in to watch a boring group game because Ronaldo happens to be playing rather than not playing, which is what this is all about. Let's be honest. That's all it is. There's nothing more substantial than that. So I do find that, really not great. But, we've got so much else to talk about that perhaps we shouldn't linger too long on Mr. Infantino.
No, but I do think, the point that you make is one that I wholeheartedly agree with. I mean, and I suppose you have spent time, as I do, probably more frequently than you these days, Charlie, in the stands and on the terraces. And there are many fans who believe that there are conspiracies afoot in football relating to various leagues and various VAR decisions and so on. You only need to glance at social media to see these things are out there. But when there is such blatant fiddling with the rule, then I think that lends credence to people who think that things are not all as they might seem. Now, people might put 2 and 2 together and make 5 and see conspiracies where there are none. But
that's part of the problem, isn't it? That is part of the problem.
Yeah.
Is that if you behave in this way, you legitimize that kind of speculation. Because you're basically saying that in principle, people who say that it's all a fiddle, in principle, they're right. Now we're just arguing over to what extent. We're just saying, well, it was a fiddle in this particular case, but actually it wasn't a fiddle in that case. But if it's a fiddle, it's a fiddle. And if I was, a nation playing in Portugal's group this summer, well, I mean, it's the type of stuff that ends up in court actions. If it ends up that Ronaldo scores a goal, Portugal get a couple of points more because of it in one of those 2 games that he should have been suspended for. And, how can you quantify the loss suffered by the country that gets knocked out by that? So, I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? Because FIFA is a supernatural body. You can still take it to CAS or something like that, or indeed sue FIFA in their home jurisdiction. I just don't. The lack of self-awareness worries me. He doesn't seem to have even worked out that this would be greeted really, really, really badly, and it has been everywhere. I checked. This is not just an English thing. Like in all major football jurisdictions, they've given this a massive raspberry. So he's got it horribly wrong. Unlike with Trump, there are no mitigating circumstances, or none worth the paper. And it just worries me, and it makes me think that actually he probably does need to go. I think he's up for re-election in 2027. I think he probably needs to go, because if this is his state of mind, that he thinks he can sort of play God with the world's favorite sport, I think that's not the right position for a president of FIFA to be in.
Let's talk about Tony Bloom then. Tony Bloom is a man we've spoken about in admiring tones on this podcast before, and he's managed to take Brighton from being a club who I saw, by the way, Charlie, defeat Hereford United in a famous game at Edgar Street. And whoever lost that game was going out of the Football League. And it was Hereford against Brighton. And I can't remember the exact details. I can vividly remember the tension in the air and the kind of faintly threatening, menacing air around Edgar Street. The upshot was that Hereford went out of the league, Brighton did enough and stayed in the league. And over the years, thanks largely to Bloom's guidance, they've climbed up and they're now a very successful Premier League club. And Bloom has also, as you've outlined, thanks to his various algorithmic insight, has helped Union Saint-Gilloise in Belgium to become quite a respectable Champions League club. He's now helping as a minority shareholder to power Hearts up the SPL. They currently sit top. But there are these allegations which have been lodged with the High Court, which I stress Bloom denies. They've been reported in The Guardian, The Times and elsewhere, suggesting that there was a betting syndicate created with a frontman who used to be an aide of Nigel Farage, for what that is worth, who was effectively executing Bloom's orders. And the allegation was that Bloom has even encouraged betting, or betting has been carried out on his behalf on games involving Brighton and Hove Albion against the rules. Now, I stress that he has denied anything like this, but I suppose it calls into question, doesn't it, whether somebody who's made their money in gambling, as Bloom has done, whether it's kind of maybe inevitable at some point that these allegations will be attracted to him or not.
So this is an area which I might, unusually you might say, just to forestall the accusation, I might be able to shed some light on this area. I can't comment on the particularities of this case. It's a report in the newspaper, you've outlined it, and it's going to be contested probably in court, right? So let's put that to one side. Put that to one side for the moment. But let me explain, as somebody who was briefly and unsuccessfully a full-time gambler myself, and then a horse racing journalist, which obviously basically a gambling journalist for the large part, etc. Has ever since then been involved in and out of gambling industry, and all this type of stuff, right? So what happens? This is why it's going to be really complex. And this is why the court cases might be quite difficult to follow, but also very interesting. So bookmakers don't like successful gamblers betting with them. And when you become successful, bookmakers close your account, right? They only like losers. That's the bottom line.
Yep.
Now, this has been true forever and a day, by the way, right? So going back 50 years, probably much more than that, but I'm talking about the last 50 years since the big betting firms became legal, properly legal. Before then, they were sort of backstreet operations. Maybe 60 years, actually. Now, what happens is there's a game of cat and mouse that goes on, where the professional gambler needs to get his money on, or her money on. The bookmaker won't take it if they know it's coming from that person. So the professional gambler, and I'm not talking about Tony Bloom here, I'm talking about all the professional gamblers going back over the last 60 years, develop a network of what we call commission agents, right? So the professional gambler will give the money to the commission agent, and the commission agent will then get the money on. And the commission agent will deploy all sorts of different ways of doing that. In the old days, what quite often happens is you find 100 different blokes with 200 quid in cash who would hit 200 different betting shops at exactly the same time to get the cash on in what would not seem extraordinary to that individual betting shop to have 200 quid, because that betting shop would not know, pre-digital of course, that the same thing was happening at exactly the same time across lots of different betting shops across the country. And it was often what we call an SP job, a starting price job, where they would all go on its starting price just before the off, right? And then the starting price was determined actually at the racetrack. So you get people from the betting companies at the last minute desperately calling their representatives in the race courses saying, can you please put some money on that horse to get the price of the horse down? Right. So the point I'm making here is that this game of cat and mouse is a long, long history, right? This has been going on a long time. Now, that then, some of the best mechanisms for the commission agents to get money on has long been through unsuccessful gamblers, right? So let's say that I'm a commission agent and I'm acting on behalf of a large Irish professional gambler, so not Tony Bloom, talking about the horse racing guys, etc. And no one wants to take that Irish gambler's money because the Irish gambler probably knows more about what's going to happen in that race than the bookmaker does. He doesn't want to take the money. So effectively what happens, he says to the commission agent, right, I want to get 10,000 quid on this horse, and I'll give you 10% of the profits if you get that money on at the right price. So I've outlined the old sort of betting shop ruse, but actually in more recent times, what tends to happen is the commission agent will have a long list of mates, contacts, who are not particularly successful gamblers. And he will say to some of those people, I'll tell you what, there's a horse that we think is going to win. We would like you to back it, right? If that horse loses, we will fund that losing bet. And if that horse wins, you will get to keep 10% of that winning bet, right? And this is a way of getting the money on in a way the bookmakers don't see coming, because that gambler is gambling on a regular basis unsuccessfully. So now we come to Tony Bloom's syndicate. Now, syndicates can mean any one of a number of things, because none of us knows what the internal commercial arrangements within that syndicate are. Who gets what, right? And who's doing what? We don't know. Almost by definition, a syndicate is a secret thing that sort of hides behind all that, right? So you might have a syndicate where Tony Bloom might well say, or indeed an Irish racing equivalent might well say, I'm actually not betting here. What I'm doing is, through my good offices, I'm offering advice to people who then go on and bet. And part of the commercial arrangement might well be, and this happens in racing quite often, that in return for proffering that advice, I then get a split of what those bets then go on to make. Now then, when that money comes back into the organization, how that then gets split up in various different ways is deeply opaque. And that's not a comment on Tony Bloom, that's a comment on all betting syndicates. They all operate differently, often on a case-to-case basis. It'll be different from one case to another. You'll say, okay, actually, do you know what? On this particular one, so-and-so is going to take more of a front role in this one, and on this one, so if you actually read the reporting around this, sort of what friends close to Tony Bloom say is that when the syndicate bets on Premier League football, it's very clear that Tony himself is backed out of that, right? But other members of the syndicate do. Well, of course. I mean, why wouldn't they? They're not Tony Bloom. They don't have an interest in Brighton, etc. But what information are they using, and where does that information come from? Might that information come from the same algorithms that effectively have been created by Star Lizard, both to power the betting operation and also to power Brighton's data recruitment operation? And if so, is that Star Lizard having an interest in that bet? What are the commercial arrangements between the people who are making that bet and with Star Lizard? We don't know. We just don't know.
And Star Lizard, just again, Star Lizard, for people who don't know, that is Tony Bloom's company, or the company which he has an interest in case people have never heard that name before. Yeah. And the opaqueness, the opacity that you refer to there.
Necessary opacity, otherwise they'd never be able to get a bet on.
Yeah, I'm just saying that there's nothing untoward or underhand about that. We're not implying anything illegal about that. that is how these things operate. So you're
It is, it,
describing
it is
the
the
action.
only way they can operate.
Mm,
It is
mm,
literally the only
mm,
way they can operate. Now, the question just is, I guess, when you sort
mm.
of come around to it, you go back to 2014 when um, Bloom had already owned Brighton for 4 years, but I think Matt Benham, his former deputy, who branched off to do his own thing, brought Brentford around them. And I think the question then really did come up. Oh, hang on a second. This is starting to be a bit awkward here. We've got professional gamblers owning multiple football clubs, and there was a sort of a bit of a rule tweak. But so under normal circumstances, when you're a football club director, you cannot bet on football at all. Under any circumstances, forget whether it's your team or another team, you cannot bet on football at all. And what they did was they sort of did a sort of carve out for those club owners or club directors who were professionally involved in betting before they became football club owners, saying, well, that is their business. And so long as they do not bet on their own club or on the competition that their own club is in, that's their whole business. We can't expect them to close down their whole business. But I think what they kind of assume, the authorities, is they had an almost, I strongly suspect this because people outside gambling don't really get it, is they sort of almost had a picture of Tony Bloom and Matt Benham pitching up to the local Ladbrokes with a bag of cash to put on Brighton and Brentford. We can't have that. And clearly they don't do that. Clearly, absolutely clearly, there is not a betting account in the name of Tony Bloom which is betting on Brighton or is betting on the Premier League. Absolutely clearly that's not happening. But the complexities of the way in which syndicates and the interrelatedness between the data algorithmic owners and the syndicates and then other partners or clients or whatever it might be that spin off the side of these types of syndicates is very, very different. Now, what's brought this to everyone's attention is a commercial dispute between a former employee of Tony Bloom and Tony Bloom. And it doesn't need much reading between the lines to work out that he thinks that Tony Bloom owes him a lot of money. He's been trying to get that money off Tony Bloom for quite a long time. And in the end, he's decided to blow the bloody doors off, right? That seems to be what's happening here. So we will find out what happens over the next weeks and months. Of course, the other bit, which is a separate story, is that one of the big losers, what we call whales in the industry, one of the whales who allegedly has been being used in this way is a guy called George Cottrell, who is an exotic figure who was once an aide of Nigel Farage's. And more recently, I think he's been living in Montenegro or something like that. But anyway, he is a guy who has regularly been losing large amounts of money on sports betting, allegedly, and therefore has allegedly been used as a front for this kind of opportunity. And it all sounds very dodgy, except that bit of it for me just isn't really. The real nasty one is the case in the US, which has been raised at the same time for a US betting company alleging that a syndicate that Bloom is involved with has been betting on the Premier League. Right now, that is the nastier one. I should stress that whilst there haven't been many formal statements around this, the clear indications from Bloom's camp is that he totally refutes this and denies it. But if I was looking at it from his point of view or their point of view, the whole sort of, George Cottrell thing and the whole syndicate thing and all that type of stuff, that will come out once they do the investigation. I'll say that's just how betting works. That's just is what it is. It's battle with the bookmakers. And if you want to feel sorry for the bookmakers, then you're welcome, but no one else is likely to. The other one of saying that somehow he is involved with a syndicate which does bet on Premier League football, that one would be, if true, that one would be a stickier one to get past.
And just to repeat, lawyers acting for Tony Bloom say they will reject any suggestion that his syndicate has placed bets on Premier League matches or games involving top flight teams in the 11 years since the FA introduced its exemption. But that's great insight and ones to follow very closely if and when they do go to court. Finally, Charlie, just thoughts on Mo Salah. He's been dropped from Liverpool. I just wonder what, as a director, as a chief executive, you would make of one of your players, and in this case, we're talking about one of your star players doing what Salah did during Liverpool's most recent game when he addressed the mixed zone after the match, which is where the sort of journalists meet with players and coaches and so on. And frankly launched a bit of a rant, a bit of an outburst against his employers. I suspect that most of us, if we were to do that against our employers in the normal course of business, would expect to get our P45 in pretty short order. But this is football and it doesn't work like that. What would you do if you were going into work tomorrow morning and Mo Salah was your problem?
Well, I think you have to start with the disastrous decision to give Mo Salah another 2-year contract. Now, if you remember at the time, Liverpool were under a lot of pressure. It was Salah and Van Dijk. And you remember the big headlines, the big banners all around, give Mo his dough, etc. And basically Salah was saying that he would stay and he wanted to stay. It was only Liverpool hadn't made him a proper offer. Anyway, whatever you regard as being a proper offer, the long and short of it is they ended up making him an enormous offer to stay for another 2 years. And of course, last year he played exceptionally well. And there was a sort of bizarre signing ceremony where he was sort of put on a throne in the pitch at Anfield, and it was all tasteless, a bit icky, really. But I'm afraid that is a bit Liverpool. And everyone went, "Oh, wasn't that wonderful? Mo got his dough," and everyone's happy. But actually, it went against Liverpool's practice over the previous 10 years. Is that when players went past a certain age, Liverpool didn't keep re-signing them, right? Because effectively you're playing Russian roulette. And this all goes back, I think, to the existence of the Liverpool research department. There was a guy called Ian Graham who ran that, who was a data scientist. I think originally actually a physicist from Cambridge, but a data scientist who would work out all the probabilities about at what time, at what time in a player's career he might go over the top and all this type of stuff. Anyhow, Ian Graham left the business a little while ago, and perhaps it's become a little bit less data-driven since then. And they fell foul of one of those classic sort of, bits of football mismanagement. Things are going well. A couple of 33-year-old players are playing well. Why not give them an extra 2 years, for goodness sake? The fans might be right. Let's do it, etc.
Because this also applied to Virgil van Dijk last summer as well. Two players well into their 30s, thereby crossing the threshold at which Liverpool would normally say, sorry, we're just not re-signing you. Good luck with your new club. Yes. But such was the fan power, such was the player power. They felt in both cases that they had to offer contracts. And given Liverpool's form this season, that's come back to bite them. Salah, not good enough to make the team. And Liverpool have invested in good new players, Ekitike and Florian Wirtz. And at the back, although Van Dijk has been playing, he certainly looked a lot shakier. So what do you do with Salah then if he is your player now on this massive contract and clearly disgruntled?
Well, under normal circumstances, when a very super elite player is throwing his toys out the pram, like Alexander Isak in the summer at Newcastle, for instance, one bit of you is thinking, well, no one rid me of this tiresome priest or whatever it was that instead of Thomas de Beckett. And then the other part of you saying, oh, shit, but he is worth 50 million, 100 million. I mean, a bit careful here. Otherwise, we could end up in a very strange situation. In this situation, I imagine that there's nothing Liverpool would like more than for him just to walk out. In terms of buyer's remorse, I imagine that if they could go back and just rip up that check that they signed for 25 million quid a year, whatever it was, earlier this year, that they would love to go back and rip it up. So then the question comes is, at what point does a player's conduct become so injurious to the organisation it actually contravenes his own contract? That's the question. Because there are clauses in a player's contract about acting in the best interests of the club. And I can't see anything that Liverpool have done that would give Mo Salah a leg to stand on when it came to saying that he's been provoked in any way. The only thing that's happened that anyone can really lay their finger on is he's been dropped, which is a professional hazard of being an elite team sports player, isn't it? That happens to the very, very best of them. And Alex Ferguson would do it on a very regular basis to the greatest names, etc. So I think probably the long and the short of it is, particularly given his long association with the club, given his hero status with the fans, etc., that the Liverpool board would not be minded to push down this route. But perhaps if it was me, I'd be asking my lawyers to have a quick look over his contract and see if potentially he's pushed the envelope far enough for us to fire him.
I don't think Fenway will do that. In the meantime, you might be having a chat with one or two agents and saying, all that talk about Saudi Arabia, Do you think Mo might fancy a move in January? Anyway, Charlie, it's been
Yeah, indeed.
fascinating as always. Thank you very much indeed. Before we go, just to remind you that my book, Where's the Money Gone? The Battle for the Soul of English Football, is available now. It'll make a great Christmas present, make a great read for you as well via Byline Books. Where's the Money Gone? The Battle for the Soul of English Football. Thanks to Jed Thomas for his production assistance on this episode, and to Mark Machado at Football Smash, who handle our socials. We'll be back next week, and then we're going to be taking a little break for Christmas. I know, but there you go. But we'll have 2 or 3 weeks off over Christmas, because why not? But we will be back next week, and I look forward to it very much. Thanks, Charlie. See you soon. Cheers now.
Thanks, Adrian.